The idea of moderation is a kind of key that we can use to understand some of the problems with the human perspective. Probably most of us view ourselves as reasonably moderate. So how did it come to be that we're careening towards a series of cliffs? It's something like finding yourself in a dream in which everything starts out normal, but then you realize as you barrel down the hill that your car has no brakes. It's not because a tempered, precautionary approach to the world is the wrong one. It is exactly the right one. A moderate behavior, properly understood, has brought us here. Here being the polycrisis, including climate catastrophe, mass extinction, the plastics crisis, water pollution, air pollution, soil depletion, and much more. The proof, if you needed it, that we're not as smart as we're cracked up to be. But we've needed moderation and precaution to be values that our governments and societies used to restrain our economic system, and they did not. So at the individual level, our immoderation is cloaked. Our lives seem normal. By the standards of our peers, we may live simply, and almost by definition by those standards, we live moderately. It's how moderation is experienced, by whether we're in the vicinity of some real or imagined average. But that's not what matters. It's how we navigate a moment, but not how our ecologies experience our accumulated impacts. I first began to think about the scope of problems like this in a period when I was reading a lot about food and health. My sister dismissed a comment I made when we were talking about the health impacts of sugar. Moderation in all things, she said. I felt a bit stymied, in the way that one sometimes may when arguing with siblings, when things can become a referendum on broader disagreements or perceived disagreements or failures of acumen. But mostly, I felt myself lose my footing and fall into a rabbit hole of time. Thanks largely to sweetened drinks, what's considered moderate sugar consumption now bears no resemblance to what was thought moderate a few generations ago, let alone a dozen generations ago, let alone 100 generations ago. And yet it's those longer spans that are most relevant for the evolution of the human body, for my own brief body and its chocolate-eating ways, and together they define the only moderation that matters, which is what humans have adapted to over time. It's a category mistake. What seems normal to the time-limited being called me is not normal for my body, because my body, and mind and psyche for that matter, is an instance of a much longer-lived being called the human body. You can take care of your body, but you can't evolve it, though you might shift how time will unfold evolution's effects on other bodies. It's important to understand that the purpose of evolution is not our own survival. Evolution no more registers you or me than we register our own heartbeats. Its concern is whether what we pass on is or is not something that helps humans survive. Nor does it only work at the level of our genes. It also works in whatever knowledge or understandings we pass on, to whomever we pass them on to. You might pass on your traits, resources, and understandings to your children, for example, in the hope that they may thrive. They act as vessels, in a way, for a subset of learning, by body, mind, and psyche, that represents and is part of the broader human evolution, part of its vivid mosaic. We are all vessels for this gradual learning, and fundamentally, that's what evolution is a slow learning by a species, and probably also by whole ecologies, towards survival, from generation to generation to generation. I have no children, but I'll pass on understandings and resources to my community, which can also learn. The genetic piece will be missing, except insofar as my young relatives are part of my community, but otherwise it's the same. And many learnings are vastly more important to evolution than genes. Various ways of finding, catching, and preserving food, for example. Arrowhead making was not passed on in the genes. It was cultural knowledge. Evolution is a collective process and visible in a beautiful and wild variety of ways. For example, at some level, what writers do is attempt to learn with other writers and readers, to come to a better understanding of the world, or to unmask one that has proven deadly. As Schweitzer said, we are life that wills to live, in the midst of life that wills to live. Part of that will is a promiscuous desire to learn, but not everything that we learn inclines us towards survival. The kind of future that humans have is essentially a judgment on whether we are capable of learning what we most need to learn at the moment when we most need to learn it. To get back to moderation for a moment, once you start to see the need to put our notions of moderation in context, you can't unsee it. For all of our history but the last couple hundred years, there wasn't a meaningful increase in the amount of stuff that most people owned, and never was there a meaningful amount of anything thrown away. Middens were mostly full of shells, bones, fabric, pottery, and excrement, all of which eventually become useful components of the soil. But in just a few generations, capitalism has rendered our consumption of chocolate, of fossil fuels, of metals, of plastics, of nearly everything wildly, mind-bendingly immoderate. At Christmas, my Depression-era mother got an orange and perhaps a sweater for school, wrapped in newsprint. But by the time my siblings and I were young, we were opening presents for an hour or two, one child with one present at a time to restrain us, and the trash bags full of packaging had to be regularly shuttled out of the room. They did not yet contain the presents themselves, but those too would be thrown away over mere months and years, because they were seldom repairable or worth handing down to children even 5 or 10 years later. Except the books. I still have many of the books. And now, of course, we don't spend hours in a bookstore agonizing over what to get for someone, and we seldom make anything. We sit on the couch and goods arrive on our doorsteps as if by magic carpet, but actually by aviation fuel and container ships and diesel, all of them in profoundly harmful measure for the communities near to the ports and warehouses. When there is both prosperity and frictionless purchasing, it turns out, buying things we never before imagined ourselves needing becomes an activity. One suggested by every website we visit, many of which helpfully link us to items we suddenly feel an urge for, though we've done fine without them all our lives thus far. The buying of green alternatives is especially seductive this way. I've always hated coffee pods for their waste, but I read an article recently that said that less coffee is used in that method, and thus it's actually more sustainable. I soon found myself perusing the pod-using coffee makers, when I realized with some embarrassment that I can simply use less coffee in my existing cotton filter. The wealthy build and outfit large homes that go empty most of the year. The middle class buy gear and gadgets and clothes that they'll likely stop using and wearing after a few months. The poor buy cheap necessities that will break in short order because the better-made versions, when they exist, cost notably more. All of these things require manufacture, shipment, and packaging, all of which are far cheaper than they should be because the costs of the associated pollution are not borne by the companies or consumers who trigger these activities. They are borne by the communities of manufacture and transport, as well as by the world writ large when it comes to the fouling of air and water and the unspooling of the climate system that allowed human thriving. Most of these items will end up in a landfill after a few months or a few years. A precious few may last longer. Even our most durable goods, our homes, are often partially ripped up every decade or two, often entirely for aesthetic reasons. That kitchen is dated, we say, and what we mostly mean is the colors. Once we consider all this, it's easy to be haunted by an awareness of the hideous piles that represent our civilizational decrepitude, like the picture of Dorian Gray, in some exceedingly non-regenerative landfill, somewhere out of our sight, that is. Old couches stuffed with polyester and foam, twisted exercise bikes and old tires, flaky nonstick pans, broken or simply old dishwashers and mixers and microwaves, and perhaps above all, plastic and foam packaging, mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of it. If we had to live with our waste, our lives would look radically different. But it's another category problem, because while we know that this way of living is historically abnormal, we don't live our lives across centuries and millennia. We make our choices across a scant handful of decades among our peers, and we're wired to live much like they do and to be skeptical of those who do not. We need to be able to hold these very different constellations in our minds and try to navigate between them. Unless we're content to magic away billions of people, there's no going back. We can't all be farmers, not if we want a single acre left for forest, grassland, or other ecosystems. Nor can we all live in caves and survive by hunting and gathering. In this era especially, making good and meaningful change in the world nearly always requires us to live and work together, and that means that it's counterproductive to see normalcy only through the lens of history. We are where we are, and we are what we are. which is a highly social species whose evolution has ingrained in us the need to care about what our peers are doing and thinking. Is it any wonder that we experience a kind of vertigo? What does it mean to be good in such a world, to be moderate in one's impacts? How do we align a desire to be good with the radical inequality of the world? One recent morning, while eating a simple breakfast in my comfortable bed, I read the news and came upon a photo of a starving boy in Gaza that turned my food to sludge in my mouth and made my own comfort briefly repellent to me. What is the moral valence of eating well while the country that has provided so many opportunities for my family is providing arms to those who starved this child and continue to starve so many like him? And it's not just him, of course, or that singular horror. Given the suffering that climate change causes, this question has many millions of cousins. The same systems that benefit us and our families devastate other families. The most important thing to say about this may be that such a state of affairs was not and is not inevitable. And it's certainly not progress, nor evolution. Evolution is not the willy-nilly increase of manufactured goods, nor even an increase in a standard of living defined more by manufactured goods than by clean air and water, rich soil, and a measure of autonomy and health and choice. Evolution is when something increases the odds of survival, and that is clearly not where we are right now. I might have chosen to fast in protest of our country's complicity. That might have had a certain logic. But to have power, acts of abnegation seem to require one of two contrary things: that one is already a figure of oversized influence, or that one is in a position so powerless that the powerlessness itself, combined with the clarity and eloquence of the renunciation, becomes a potent force. Or perhaps both, if one is a well-known political prisoner. As an ordinary person, any fast I might undertake would likely result in little more than a shrug. So here we are. Our ideas of moderation are nonsensical, and yet for most of us, renunciation isn't much use either. As people of privilege in the developed world, in a moment when the Earth's most fundamental natural systems are coming undone due to the economic systems that have supported and enriched us, what is a morally and intellectually honest way to live? As a society, we need to realign our ideas of a good and normal life with the needs of the natural world. One way to start this, perhaps, is to remember the simple fact, galloping towards us like a horseman of the apocalypse, that we cannot long have any good life, perhaps not any life at all, without a thriving natural world. We depend on it for every breath, every bite, every drink of water. We are not sprung from the mind of Zeus. We are the natural world, and it is us. We're made of such ingredients as plants and water and light and hunting and running and tenderness and conversation and sex. Even now, nature spins the threads of any thriving new world we might eventually weave. For example, in our ever greater understandings of systems, of the fractal nature of the world, and of the capabilities of other creatures. Imagine what we are capable of if we choose to thrive on a thriving planet. Everything about us emerges from Earth's astonishing abundance, and it likely always will. But if we devastate the abundance itself, our own options for thriving diminish accordingly. Even if you believe that someday we will thrive on other planets, surely you cannot believe that there are any within reach now that are even 10% as hospitable for us as even a deeply damaged Earth is. That being the case, our ability to eventually arrive elsewhere depends entirely on our ability to thrive and learn here, which further depends entirely on a thriving natural world. If you aren't worried about the food supply, and you should be, and you aren't worried about weather extremes, and you should be, and you aren't worried about pandemics, or air quality, or water quality, or endocrine disruptors, or PFAs, or the number of guns in this country, and you definitely should be, then consider whether the world of hunger, pandemic, and upheaval that's coming at us if we keep to our current trajectory is the world in which we have the resources to do our best and most creative science, the science that will allow thriving here and elsewhere. Day to day, insofar as we ask ourselves the question of how to live in the quiet discomforts of our own hearts, it seems to me to be the wrong question or set of questions. It presupposes approaching our decisions as a matter of individual goodness, individual willingness, or lack thereof, to sacrifice or change, as well as individual capacity to do good. All of these can be meaningful, of course. They can help us live in a way that's better aligned with what we want for the world and our children, and they can help set an example. But those decisions are more like fireflies than they are like stars to navigate by. Our ability to even see the right thing in a wrong system flickers on and off, moment to moment, dependent on context and our level of attention. We might forego a dinner out and give the money to a good cause in one moment, and in the next we order something we don't really need, or book a flight, or, well, almost anything. Because again, we're trying to make good decisions in a bad system. It's a fool's game, and if we tear our hair out over every single choice we make, we won't have the energy for the larger project of changing the world so that it aligns with our values. If a nation truly cherishes both freedom and nature, for example, and believes that competition brings the best results, then it ought to be illegal to manufacture or import goods that compete by using slave labor, by dumping toxic chemicals in a river, or by devastating the climate system. Neoliberal capitalism doesn't simply allow these things. Because it focuses on price and profit above all else, it actively encourages them. Anyone who does not minimize wages or who deals properly with waste can be at a real disadvantage. To obscure this truth, it relies on closed doors and greenwashing and contracting and above all distance, which make it nearly impossible for people to know what they're propping up when they buy something, thus rendering it Kafkaesque to somehow place the burden of moral choice on the person standing in the grocery store wondering which toilet paper causes the least amount of harm. The very existence of something labeled shade-grown fair trade coffee, honestly, should enrage us. It's a policy failure, and an admission that all the rest is grown and processed with little to no attention to the well-being of the natural world or our fellow humans. The humans, presumably, are supposed to be glad they have jobs at all, and the earth is supposed to be endlessly resilient to our devastations. If you get cheap coffee, companies seem to ask, then why are you complaining? Bill McKibben has said for years that the most frequent question he gets is, what can one person do? And his answer is, don't be just one person. In other words, work with others. This shift in perspective is related to the problem of time that I mentioned earlier, that we live in mere decades, yet evolution occurs over millennia. We forget the power that our collective efforts can have, just like we forget the ways that our bodies and cultures may change over generations, and we instead feel marooned in our inability to change things. But collective decisions by companies and policymakers dug us into this hole, and collective pressures on those same companies and policymakers can begin to dig us out. What do we truly value? How do we build those values into our social structures, laws, and economic life? These are the central questions of our time, and in order to address them, we have to make visible what's been obscured. We live in a world where the dirtiest forms of energy are still the most widespread, even though they cost more, kill people, and devastate ecosystems. Where energy-ravenous AI is increasingly integrated into our internet searches, where fully 25% of Earth's landmass is given over to livestock, and where the mining of a single Bitcoin is allowed to use the same amount of energy as the average household uses in more than a dozen years. If you asked people if those things made sense, they'd look at you like you had three heads. And yet we keep electing politicians that are in the pocket of the interests that want to keep it this way, or who are at least too timid to suggest the fundamental changes we need. And we're simply not demanding those changes loudly and clearly enough, in numbers high enough. As for companies, they aren't just operating in the same bad system. Many of them are fighting to make it still worse. The form that fight usually takes is an immediate allergy to anything that looks like care for the commons. In other words, regulation. Right now, we're seeing the accumulated effects of allowing a massive socialization of risk to hide behind the privatization of profits. Precautionary regulation applied broadly is wholly compatible with competition, and more importantly, it's compatible with a living Earth. Fighting for better options for everyone and for the tight control of the consumption of limited resources is how we get away from the problem of being just one person. It's how we enable the alignment of the dominant human trait, our social nature, and the thriving of the natural world. If we push governments to take a precautionary approach to things like AI, fossil fuel use, and novel chemicals, then even our bad individual decisions won't be catastrophic for the planet and for everyone on it. That doesn't seem like too much to ask. I personally would like to live in a world where purchasing the wrong toilet paper didn't result in the logging of an old-growth forest, as it does now. We can understand ourselves as something like leaves on a tree that will last for thousands of years. We do imagine that to some degree, of course. We speak of our family trees. But again, it's not just genetics. It's community-wide and species-wide, at least. I have no children, but what I leave behind, actions, objects, words, relationships, will nevertheless influence future generations, and I am still part of a tree, as well as part of a human forest that's interconnected and alive and in constant intercourse with all of Earth's species, from bacteria to blue whales, even when, no, especially when, this is unconscious and at a distance of time or space, like that toilet paper and that forest, for example. But here's the thing, if we're not consciously choosing otherwise, there's no question but that our primary legacy will be the vastness of the pollution we leave behind. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire, and it doesn't matter if you have what you think are good genes. If you're not working against the probability of leaving your children a planet of wreckage and fire, well, that's an evolutionary failure of the first order. And the truly warped thing about our current economic system is that precisely that failure has been rewarded. The less one thought about the natural world that we utterly depend on, the more money one could make. It's been a race to the bottom, with human and environmental costs seen as irrelevant, as external to the real thing, which was making money and manufacturing and getting more stuff. We're nearing the end of that ride, one way or another. Either we dismantle it or it takes us all down. There are consequences to the worldview that has kept us from seeing our collective impacts. 250 years ago, even Captain Cook, soldier of empire that he was, understood that our ideas of progress were suspect. From what I have said of the natives of Australia, they may appear to some to be the most wretched people upon earth, he wrote in his journal. But in reality, they are far more happier than we Europeans. The earth and sea, of their own accord, furnishes them with all things necessary for life. They covet not magnificent houses, household stuff, etc. They live in a warm and fine climate and enjoy a very wholesome air. They seemed to set no value upon anything we gave them. Europeans devastated the lives of autonomy and plenty that the Australian First Peoples had, of course, but the ability to cheat and steal didn't represent a higher level of evolution. Far from it. Instead, the colonial project, with its glee for extraction and extermination, set humanity on precisely the path that has landed us here, surrounded by our stuff, with plastic-filled oceans and drinking water, summers of deadly heat and fire, and an atmosphere so altered that the seasons have come unspooled. The good news is that, like leaves, we can use our collective power to feed the tree so that it's durable and thriving for our children. It's not a simple task, but it is straightforward. We have to make sure that our social nature begins working far more for a thriving world than against one, as it is now. Biophilia is in our blood. The scent of a fresh breeze, the sound of rain or waves, the sight of dappled sun through a tree canopy, the taste and crispness of a really good apple, the many fascinations of our creaturely cousins. All of these are capable of reminding us who we are, a species whose home is a rich and spectacularly varied planet. It's important to note here that if someone is working 2 jobs, or commuting 3 hours a day, or living next to a chemical plant or a strip mall, they probably don't have much access to or attention for these beauties, which is just one of many reasons we need to care about everyone's living conditions and access to the natural world. It's hard to treasure what we do not know. But it's not people without that access who are the problem. It's the people who think that we can somehow divvy up the natural world's health into mine and yours, who will treasure their own beach, imagining that somehow a distant offshore wind farm will ruin it, but believe that somehow the eroding beaches, dead coral reefs, acidifying water, hypoxic dead zones, and hot tub-like temperatures of the sea near other people will leave them unscathed. These are the people whose money rots our media and our political life, which facts are among the first problems we need to fix. Imagination may be our most necessary muscle in the tasks before us. not just because we need to understand ourselves as a collective force and a species moving through time among countless other species, but also because it's cooperation in hunting and much else that likely was our greatest strength over our primate cousins. But cooperation on the scale that's required now is hard to picture. Many people, no matter their politics, simply don't see the possibility of human systems reorienting towards such cooperation. Some arm themselves and stockpile food, others leapfrog in their minds to some fuzzily imagined post-apocalyptic seed colony because they can't imagine having any meaningful agency in between here and there. But assuming apocalypse as a singular, inevitable thing, as opposed to accepting that we're moving into a period of great instability with a wide range of possible outcomes, consigns billions of people and countless other creatures to vastly more suffering than climate catastrophe by itself will do. And that points to the truth that we have never had more ability to shape the arc of the future than we do now. There are really only two options. We try to save one another and as many of Earth's creatures as possible, or we fail to try. Ignore for a moment what Earth's wild and destabilized forces may do to us. Mostly, we should fear what we may do to ourselves, and then consider what we can do for ourselves, because we have control over that. You have control over that, and vastly more so if you work with others. Not only because more people can do more things, but also because there are few things as capable of softening hearts, enlivening imaginations, and building courage as the feeling that people get when they work together for the common good, doing their best to live up to those they admire and to be worthy of the admiration that others may feel towards them. Many angry people rightly feel that their lives have been diminished, and they have been actively misled about who and what is to blame. They may deeply mistrust any notions of the collective good. This can be overstated. Excuse me. The enormous support for Bernie Sanders a few years ago makes that clear. But it has been very, very profitable for some individuals and companies to deepen the divisions and the anger and to look for scapegoats. So they have done so. If we want to shift culture, we have to make it clear that we're fighting for everyone. No one is expendable. No one is beyond redemption. Assuming it survives the election, there's policy in the works that may ease some divisions. The just announced grants for decarbonizing heavy industry seem likely to complicate, in a good way, the politics of red states, since companies and thus regions will need huge amounts of clean energy in order to get those grants. Again, policies dug us into this hole. Policies can build us a ladder out. For me, the simplest and most useful way of thinking about how we as individuals can interact with the world in this moment is that we should seek to be in service to the earth and to each other in the best ways we can. Let me be clear, this is by no means something I accomplish with any level of purity. I act regularly in the service of other desires, like reading, writing, time with loved ones, running, chocolate, and trips to the beach or mountains. I buy more than I need, and I'm judgmental and impatient. Like most people, I have literally countless failings. But I do my best not to use my imperfections as a self-loathing reason not to seek to be in service, and I try to always be open to learning. Last summer, some friends and I started a new grassroots group to respond to the dire need to pressure big polluters. These companies consider themselves utterly normal, even innovative. The terrifying thing is, they are utterly normal. They do not think that they're major contributors to the end of the world as we know it, but they are. Everything and everyone around them is oriented towards the existing world, the one that's headed for the cliff, and their entire infrastructure is driving them forward without brakes. When it suits their PR, they'll make changes at the margins, but in order to see real change in the way they operate, we need something else. Sometimes that something else can be industrial policy, as with the big grants I just mentioned. But carrots aren't enough, not by any means. To hasten the end of the fossil fuel era and help restore the planet's health, we need to create truly unprecedented collective pressure for tight regulation of greenhouse gases and other pollution, regulation that penalizes profit-seeking at the expense of communities and planet. And while we work to build that pressure, we need to shame big polluters into doing at least enough of the right things that we buy some time. We're literally talking about the future of life on Earth, after all. It's worth all the effort we can give it. So we started a new group focused on strategic and creative NVDA, or nonviolent direct action, and also on building community. Climate change often makes people feel overwhelmed and grief-stricken, and activists of all kinds can get deeply depleted by what's nearly always a long-term battle against major social and economic powers. So in our new group, we see it as our job to help people connect with each other in order to build power, yes, but also trust and community. We're just months old and still small, but we've already helped to save, at least temporarily, a patch of biologically important public forest at the peak of its carbon absorption. And we've helped to ungreenwash the employees of one of the world's biggest climate polluters. They, in turn, may be able to pressure their employer to make at least a few meaningful changes, which may help spur changes amongst the company's competitors. Every domino matters. The good news is that there are millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, of people across the world working to minimize climate devastation in a wide variety of ways. How every one of us makes use of our light determines how the tree grows. We don't have to find a magic bullet. We don't even have to see how it all fits together. We simply have to find opportunities to make a difference. Or to quote Bill McKibben again, our job is to give hell to the bad guys and help the good ones. In truth, I sometimes feel a little fraudulent talking about working together. I need solitude as much as anyone I know, and for a long time, I resisted activism, which seemed to involve too many people. Yet I've come to understand that I love solitude in part because it allows me to be present to the natural world in a way that's more difficult in human company. And it also allows me to find rest and connection in my thoughts, which aren't solely self-generated, after all. They emerge from conversations, from reading, and from relationship with people and animals and all that I encounter. Solitude helps me integrate the complexity and beauty of the world, in other words, but it's connection that defines that complexity and that beauty. This is the magic trick, to see that our selfhood is richly peopled with others, human and non-human, and to see that our lives are a brief and brilliant play of light in the flow of history. What we do to the world, we do to ourselves. What we do for the world, we do for ourselves. What better connections can I ask for than those of people working to stop harms and to restore the world? I think it's likely that my faith in human nature is much higher than most people's because of the work that I do. But the good news is that this faith is available to anyone with a little time. If you think it's a dog-eat-dog world, in other words, you're probably hanging out with the wrong dogs. The daily changes that we make to be gentler to this world and its creatures matter. But we have to keep our eye on the context, always. If we continue to allow bitcoins to be mined and gas to be fracked for AI to be used in a widespread way, and if we allow the deep sea to be raped as the land has been, we will have utterly lost the existential war for this beautiful world and for our own lives and possibilities. So join with others, join with even one person, and find a way to work towards the profound changes that we need in order to find out what a modern life on a vibrant earth can look like. Again, our task is to make sure our social nature begins to work far more for a thriving world than against one. Not keeping up with the Joneses, perhaps, but barn-raising some new affordable housing with them. The power that we have brought to bear in this world, negatively and utterly without meaning to, can serve as a reminder of the power that we can bring to bear when we wake up and do the right and evolutionary thing, acting in the service of our own survival and the thriving of the planet that has offered us everything.